It's my great pleasure to welcome you here today for our post-election panel, How Will the 2018 Elections Influence Policymaking and the 2020 Race for the White House, which seems a little premature, and yet that has been the subject of much conversation since election night 9 days ago. When we scheduled this panel, we wanted to give at least a week's time because I figured, well, by mid-November, we'll know the election results. And we should have learned from 2016 that, or maybe even back to 2000, that election night announcements are not necessarily decisive. Nevertheless, I think we are well positioned now to talk about the effects of what is certainly the Democratic control, win of the majority control of the House of Representatives, significant gains for Democrats in state gubernatorial races and state houses. And while the Senate seats are still, it looks as though the Republican Party will continue to have control, the exact number remains undecided, on a couple of key races. We've also seen historic voter turnout in at least 50 years for a midterm election. And I have to say, just personally, having overseen events at Hofstra for the Calico Center since 2006, another highly important midterm election year, I don't recall ever seeing such heightened interest from the public, from journalists, from classes, in the elections and the results. And I think that Hofstra, while maybe we can't take credit, we certainly can't take credit for the high national voter turnout. Certainly the Hofstra Votes program illustrated here the importance of voting in a democracy. To discuss these topics today, we have three distinguished speakers. I'm going to turn the floor over to them in a moment. I just want to say a thank you to the Hofstra classes and the high school classes. I think St. Dominic's and Island Trees are joining us today. Glad to have you with us. Dr. Parati's American Politics class, my American Politics class, Dr. Burnett's State and Local Politics class, Professor Bengal's Writing Studies class, and numerous other students and guests, faculty guests taking the time to join us today. So thank you. Our three speakers will be our Calico Center Senior Presidential Fellows and New York-based Senior Political Reporter Celeste Katz. Let me introduce each of them. Howard Dean and Ed Rollins have been Calico Center Senior Presidential Fellows since 2009. Howard Dean is a former chairman of the Democratic National Committee, U.S. presidential candidate, six-term governor of Vermont, and practicing physician. He currently is a senior strategic advisor and independent consultant for the government affairs practice at Denton's LLP, an international law firm. He also serves as a contributor on MSNBC and is the founder of Democracy for America. Dr. Dean transitioned from full-time practice in medicine in 1982 in Vermont to an elected representative position. He served as governor for 12 years and then left office to run for president in 2003, where he implemented what were at the time innovative fundraising strategies, including use of the internet. As chairman of the Democratic National Committee, Governor Dean created and implemented the 50-state strategy, which was credited with helping Democrats make historic electoral gains in 2006 and 2008. Mr. Ed Rollins is one of the leading political strategists and communications experts in the United States. He managed President Ronald Reagan's 49-state landslide re-election campaign in 1984, and he has had major managerial roles in 9 other presidential campaigns. Mr. Rollins has served in the administrations of 4 U.S. presidents, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan, and George H.W. Bush, including 2 tours of duty as assistant to the president, the highest staff appointment in the White House. In the Reagan administration, Mr. Rollins directed the White House offices of political affairs and intergovernmental affairs, and he served as deputy chief of staff during President Reagan's second term. In September 2009, in 2010, he was inducted into the American Association of Political Consultants Hall of Fame. Ms. Celeste Katz is a New York-based senior political reporter for Glamour magazine and also recently just became a co-host of Driving Forces on WBAI FM New York Radio and is a guest host for Sirius XM satellite radio. Celeste Katz has been active in writing about American politics for several years. She previously was a senior politics writer for Newsweek. She has served as a host on Sirius XM on 3-hour live talk show programs, including The David Webb Show and Patriot Tonight. During the 2016 presidential election, she was senior political correspondent for Mike, and she co-hosted Special Relationship, an international podcast that was jointly presented with The Economist and recognized by the Poynter Institute. Before she joined Mike, Celeste Katz was a political correspondent, a columnist, and a blogger for the New York Daily News from 2000 to 2015. She covered City Hall, Albany, New York State Capitol, of course, and spanned 4 presidential, gubernatorial, and mayoral elections. In fact, we were just saying this week that we discussed in the summer of 2015 the presidential race, and I think that was actually before the first presidential debate in Cleveland. And since then, the number of unexpected twists and turns in American politics have only continued. So please join me in welcoming our 3 distinguished guests. And as we discussed, I'd like to begin by asking Celeste Katz to talk about the 2018 elections. Then we'll go to Howard Dean and Ed Rollins and move forward from there. Thank you.
So good morning, everybody. My name is Celeste Katz. I'm a reporter for Glamour magazine, and I'm host for Sirius XM and WBAI Radio. And I'm not going to do a lot of prepared remarks because mostly as a reporter, I listen rather than talk, ideally, which is kind of weird for somebody who does radio. But basically just here to hear from you guys and to hear from these 2 gentlemen, both of whom have actually interviewed about politics in the past, about what was an extremely interesting and exciting and kind of weird election season. A lot of young people getting involved in elections this year, a lot of people running, especially women running for the first time as candidates, a lot of historic wins. And we're still waiting. The results are still out on some of these big races, certainly the Stacey Abrams race in Georgia, which brings up a lot of questions, not only about being firsts and about breaking barriers in politics, but about the nature of voter election administration, voter suppression, and how well our democracy is working. I'm sure that we'll have some stuff to talk about there. The question that we looked at a lot in this contest was, yeah, my mic is still real bouncy, so I don't know if I have is there anybody in the booth? Oh, okay, awesome, thank you. Anything you can do to make me sound smarter, or just, okay.
It sounds great. We'll work with what we have. Thank you.
And one of the big things was about this election, and I'll just leave it here and stop talking, let the other guys go, but I'm sure we'll get into this, was that this election was not just about the people on the ballot. This election, by design and by personal request, was about Donald Trump. He asked people literally to pretend he was on the ballot. I think a lot of them did. As a result, the Democrats now have control of the House of Representatives. Republicans retain slim control of the Senate. And we have a divided government, which may be exactly what he wanted. So thanks. Looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Celeste. Howard, do you want to go?
Sure. My take on the election is different than most people's. I obviously think it's great that the Democrats took back the House and took 7 governorships and flipped a bunch of legislatures. That's really important. But I think the big thing that happened is that young people have now begun the process of taking over the Democratic Party. Most of the gains that were not made because the DNC and the DCCC did a fantastic job, although I think the DCCC did do a good job. Most of the gains that were made were because there were a whole lot of groups like Run for Something, Indivisible, Swing Left, Color of Change, Collective PAC, Voter Latino, and about 8 more that were completely grassroots groups that did basically all but one of the functions that you have to have in order to win a race. They reached out to core constituency groups. They raised money. They recruited candidates, 15,000 candidates. We flipped almost, I guess, 350 legislative seats. That's over a third of the ones we've lost in the last 8 years. And that was because grassroots politics is back, but it's not the Democratic Party in Washington that's doing all that. It's young people who were absolutely energized by Donald Trump's win. First, they were in despair, but they, of course, being young, quickly recovered. And this is what they've done for the last 2 years. So, look, both parties are in trouble. Both parties have to change. The change process in our party has already begun, and we're well on the way. This is going to be hard. You're going to see this in the battle for who's going to be the speaker, whether traditionally, of course, Nancy Pelosi would be reelected easily. But a lot of people said they weren't going to do it. And I don't think they're going to change their vote, because a lot of these people came and voted in the process because they were sick of politics, and they're young. The average age of the Democrats in Congress dropped 10 years with one election. That's extraordinary. So I make more of the election than just all the great things because as a Democrat, I'm pleased that we took all these seats. I think it's the beginning of a process that had to happen. And it's going to be a relatively peaceful process, even though, of course, the press is going to crank it up as much as possible to make it look fun and exciting and horse racing. But it is a relatively peaceful process to what's, I think, compared to what's going to happen in the Republican Party, which is very old and very white, and that's not where this country is going.
Thank you, Howard.
As someone who's old and white,
There's two of us up here, male.
I will say something that Donald Trump will not say as a Republican. We got our butts kicked big time. And it wasn't just young people who did it. It was in the suburbs. It was women who've been angry ever since Trump was inaugurated, basically turned out in extraordinary numbers. The numbers alone are extraordinary. Historically, in a midterm election, there's about a 30 to 40% drop-off from a presidential year. This year, if the final numbers turn out to be 117 million people, this will be the second largest turnout since 1966. 1966 was the year that the 18-year-old vote came into existence, and was the first election after all the civil rights stuff. So this was a monumental election in the sense of turnout, monumental election in the sense of participation, monumental election in the sense of extraordinary candidates, which Democrats did a fabulous job of recruiting some great, great talent who went out and took on incumbents, including, we had a wonderful Hofstra graduate here, Congressman MacArthur, who was out here recently to a businessman in New Jersey, a more moderate, who lost in a very close, very tough race, and that was announced yesterday. There are no Northeast Republicans hardly anymore. You have Peter King out here at the island, but you see what happened in New York. I mean, New York is now a very staunch Democrat state, as it always has been. But even the suburbs now have been pretty much cleaned out. And obviously, I come from California, which has now been, for a long period of time, a very staunch Democrat. This was an election that Donald Trump decided to make his own and went out and campaigned as aggressively as anybody I've ever seen. And basically, I think loved the rallies, loved going out, having the adulation, but didn't really move numbers. He may have saved a couple of people in the Senate and mobilized certainly his support. But we are a very polarized electorate, and we're more polarized after this election than we've ever been before. And part of the reason, if you look at exit polls, and unfortunately I brought the exit polls to sort of rattle off here, but somehow when I come out to Hofstra, my iPad never seems to work for some reason. I get in this no man's land.
Ooh, I know what's in the
So I won't be exact, but I'll be close. When you look at issues to Democrats, the overwhelming issue was health care. Health care has been an issue before. For Republicans, repealing health care was the rallying cry in a couple of midterms, and obviously you got Republicans the majority. Democrats went out and basically said certain health care issues are very, very important. we came back, and overwhelmingly Democrats see that as their most important issue. Immigration to the Republicans was equally their overwhelming issue, and obviously that's the one thing the president did. But I can tell you, some of us run a lot of campaigns. I would hate to have run a campaign the last month for two reasons. One is there was more money than ever been spent in a midterm election, more money than any presidential race. Every single candidate who was viable had unbelievable amounts of money. And Democrats raised more money and basically spent more money effectively than Republicans have. Republicans ran a very Washington-based driven campaign in which there was no clarity to the message, and part of that was Trump was the message, and Trump became the message to both those who were against him and those who were for him. And I think at the end of the day, the president has to understand, and having sat through many sessions in which he has talked about, I had the greatest election ever, I won more electoral votes than ever, I did more of this, more of that. As someone that ran Reagan's campaign where we won 49 states, I always want to say, Mr. President, I just want to tell you something. Well, the truth of the matter is the American public told him something. And when you really look at this election, and this doesn't mean he's going to lose in 220, Democrats still have a long, tedious process to get through, and they probably have 20 candidates, and I doubt we'll have any serious challenge to him if he chooses to run for re-election, because it's really his party. And when you look at the polling numbers, 78, 80% of all Republicans today support him, and certainly there's no place for Flake or Kasich or anything else. The other side is Democrats will have the drill that we had last time, where you'll have 20 candidates, no front runner, obviously, and obviously you'll have all the debates and all the rest of it, and sooner or later it'll evolve. And I think anybody that attempts to predict at this point in time will be as successful as any of us who would have predicted 5 years ago that Donald Trump was going to be the nominee or Donald Trump was going to be the president. What I think is very, very important to notice, and having had a long history in politics, I've been here before, and that doesn't mean there's a good outcome to this. I was there, I was the White House political director in 1982 when we lost 28 House seats and picked up 1 Senate seat, kind of similar to what this is. This will end up probably being 35, 36 seats loss and 2 Senate seat pickup. Reagan came back 2 years later and won 49 states. I'm not saying that's what's going to happen with Trump, but I'm just simply saying it's not the end of the world. It's the end of a complacency in which Republicans have to basically decide what it is their message is. And I personally think the next 2 years is going to be nothing but chaos. I think that you've got 100 new members on the Democratic side, be the largest class since the Watergate class, the 74. You've got a lot of different directions people are going, as you can see in the speaker's race. I mean, normally someone like Nancy Pelosi would automatically be reelected. And certainly no one has been more tireless and raised more money than she has. But she's got a real fight on her hand, and there's no guarantee, even though I think she probably does end up being speaker. I'm not an expert on the Democrats like Howard is, but I think some of the new members are desperately looking for an alternative, and again, that'll be something we'll watch the next couple of weeks. I don't think much is going to get done. I think we're going to spend 2 years in which Howard and I are talking about coming out here. The two major issues: how do you fix the healthcare system, which is what Democrats talked about, and Republicans want to how do you fix the immigration programs. And neither can do it without bipartisan support, and there is no bipartisan anything. And I think the reality is that you're going to have 2 years of trench warfare. The country's going to get more disgusted. I would assume by the end of this week or by a week after Thanksgiving, the 20 Democratic candidates are going to run at the start of their campaigns. Trump started his campaign 2 years ago, named his campaign manager a year and a half ago, and it'll be an enormous amount of money. But in the meantime, the governing process gets slowed down or becomes non-existent, and that's not good for the country, and that will just frustrate many of the young people who did vote, many of the women who did vote, who want something to happen. So I'm an old man, and obviously I've watched a lot of this before, and I think the most important thing is I think Democrats are very well positioned. I had always said when people asked me how long are the Republicans going to hold a majority, I said we had very effective reapportionments in 2010 and 2000, how we got the majority. We've had the majority for 8 years. I didn't think Democrats could take back the majority until after the 2020 reapportionment. They now have it. There'll be big players on how they redraw the lines. When you look at the states that Trump won, which he drew sort of straight inside flush, the Pennsylvanias, the Wisconsins, the Michigans, Wisconsin, Michigan. I said Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania.
Florida's always the swing state, will be the swing state again. But when you look at the numbers, a shift of 100,000 votes would have given those 4 states to Hillary and should have been the president easily. So the reality is Democrats can win losing Ohio, but they can't lose Wisconsin, they can't lose Michigan, and they can't lose Pennsylvania, but they can lose Ohio. So the reality is Trump won 30 states. I can't think of any state that he can add to that mix. I can think of a couple that he could lose. Equally as important, if it's Hillary or whoever, it's going to be hard to basically, the battleground is going to be the same battleground it was 2 years ago. And my sense is Wisconsin has been altered by a new governor, senator got reelected there. Michigan obviously was a wake-up call 2 years ago. You've elected a governor and a senator, reelected a senator. Pennsylvania, the governor got reelected. None of that matters a whole lot, but it does have something to do with where you move forward. And I think to a certain extent, we will see a lot of gnashing of teeth, a lot of people new people especially, trying to do things. And unfortunately, you get divided government again. Some people like divided government. Some people basically think divided government is good because nothing gets done. I personally think I've always kind of become an advocate of having spent 50 years of my life in this business. Let one party have it all, see how far they can get with the ball. If they fail, fumble, give it to the other party. This is the worst of all worlds. You've got Trump who's going to have his agenda. You're going to have Democrats who are going to have an agenda in the House with new, younger leadership, I assume. And even if Nancy Pelosi's there, she has to basically keep her finger in the air and make sure that that new, young leadership doesn't topple her. Candidates out there, several senators, or Democrat senators who are going to want to run. So you've got really a very fascinating point of view from both students' perspective, from political science perspective, from historical perspective. But I think to a certain extent, Trump is a reality show president, and no one ever basically dominated a midterm, at least in my lifetime, like he did, good and bad. And my sense is he's terribly frustrated at this point, and I think that he'll find himself incapable of getting what he wants out of the Congress. In a way, he may be better off by having the House, because then he can basically run against the House, and the House clearly will try and make his life as miserable as possible. I'm not sure how you make it more miserable than it's been the last 2 years. But I think to a certain extent, if you're a student of politics, a student of cable television, the ratings will be high, the frustration of the country will be high. And you begin with a president, all the exit polls and some of the early polls that have come out post-election, Trump sits at 34%. Would you vote to re-elect Donald Trump? 34%. His base is probably around 40%, so he's a little below his base. You can't win the presidency with 34%. You can win the presidency with 45%. As I've said here before, we now have a situation where it's not just one Republican versus one Democrat. There's always about 4 or 5 other candidates that probably pick up 5-6% of the vote. There's no question Democrats are going to win the plurality of the voters because of California and New York. I think Arizona is now definitely in play. Florida is always in play. It's a 1% state, as we're seeing going through this drill again. You now have 1.2 million former felons who can now vote again by referendum that was passed in Florida. I'm not sure all of them will, but maybe a couple 100,000 of them do. And the reality of that to change the dynamics. And equally as important, many people in the Puerto Rican communities who can move anywhere they want to, they're citizens. Many are moving to Florida. They didn't vote in quite the numbers that they thought they were this time, but certainly in 2 years, I think there'll be great efforts to reach out to them. So Florida, which again is a couple thousand, 20, 30, 40,000 vote differential, as we're seeing again, and all these recounts, will be the big battleground again in 2 years. So I think as Americans, we want some order, and we certainly want some civility, and I don't think that's going to happen. And I think to a certain extent, that's, as an old man who's watched it for a long time, I think the disturbing thing to me is the hatred, the bitterness that's out there today, and I think that's not a good thing for the country, not a good thing for anybody. You can have political parties, and you can obviously have dialogue. Howard and I, in the 10 years we've been out here, become very dear friends. There are many things we don't agree on, some things we do agree on, but we like each other, and we talk to each other. And to me, one of the things that's happening in American politics is that both sides don't like each other, and they don't talk to each other. And I think it's even going to be worse as we move forward.
Thank you, Ed. I'd like to pick up first with a point about the president and then move to Congress, and then I also want to talk about voting and the media, particularly election night coverage. But let me start with Trump, with President Trump, because Celeste, you ended with an interesting point. You said, did Trump actually want divided government, perhaps, or the semi-divided government that we have? And Ed, you were just talking about what this means to have a Democratic House and a Republican Senate, the decline of order and civility, the blocking of legislation. I guess the question is, and then Howard, you're talking about the challenges of leadership in the Democratic Party. Two questions. We know that midterm elections, to some degree, are a referendum on the president, but it was much more so in 2018 than in previous years. Typically, presidents try to stay out of the way in midterms, particularly because their approval ratings have gone down. And you have candidates who will cite the president's accomplishments, but also, as the election day nears, focus on them, right, on their work for their constituents, their district, their state. 2018 was different. This was, not only did the White House, the president actively campaign on saying this is a vote, right, to get things done for us, but then Democrats campaigned against that. So why was that the case? And what will this semi-divided government mean? Is there any way, it's easy to see the chaos, the lack of order that you talked about, Ed, but, Celeste, you suggested maybe this is what the president wanted. How can this be beneficial? So why was the president so much a part of, why was the 2018 such a referendum on the president, and how will that affect governance?
I think that well, first of all, I guess midterms, as you mentioned, it's fair to say, are often a referendum on the president, especially a new president, and the ruling party. You expect a president to lose a couple of seats. I interviewed Ronna McDaniel, who's the chairwoman of the Republican National Committee, in June, before really it wasn't me, I'm sorry. God strike me.
Sorry,
for,
I knew you were a radio person. I'm sorry. We should have double-checked this.
She was obviously trying to lower the bar and say, look, we're going to lose a couple of seats. Traditionally this happens when a new president comes in, you lose a couple. But at the same time, why did this become a referendum on the president? Partly because this was people's chance to respond to the policies of a new administration, which include things like, whether you like them or not, attempts to put in a travel ban, to have a proposed border wall, family separations, the nomination and confirmation of a new Supreme Court, two new Supreme Court justices, the latter being obviously much more controversial, Brett Kavanaugh, than the former Neil Gorsuch. The other reason is because the president likes it to be about him. He likes a lot of things to be about him. And he has certainly, whether it's from having been a reality show star, having been somebody who grew up not that far from here, actually in Queens, and made a name for himself in business. I still haven't seen his tax return, so I can't tell you how well that's gone, but I am working on that project for you as we speak. The president likes campaigning. I think there is some dispute as to how much he likes governing, but he very much likes campaigning. And even in battleground states, I think you saw him working a lot of friendly rooms. I think that you saw him not necessarily trying to convince new people to come over to his side and say, hey, join the team. He, in a way, for a guy who changed the way politics worked in a lot of ways, he actually has a very traditional approach in terms of voting. A lot of times in voting, and I'm sure that the gentleman here can tell you, the old school version of it was that you had these people called like prime voters, triple prime voters. This person who shows up for every election and votes for your party. It doesn't matter who the candidate is, the sort of straight ticket voter. Okay, and that there was going to be a certain number of people who showed up in elections, especially in midterms, which Americans don't like to vote in. I think 2014 was a historically sucky year for midterm turnout, so 2018 beat expectations certainly, but it was bad 4 years ago. And that there was going to be this sort of pot of voters, people that actually bother to show up. And so the idea wasn't to bring in new voters and get new people excited about politics. It was about fighting over this say the election was going to be decided by the people in this room. And the parties would basically like lock the doors and fight over every vote in this room. Instead of saying there's an entire campus of people outside, maybe they've never voted, maybe they haven't registered to vote yet, but we can get those people involved. We can have advertising and events to get them interested. We can talk about issues that interest them. So in a way, Trump brought people into the party, but his mobilization approach, I think, in the midterms was a little bit more traditional, which is like, if you want the wall, if you think that immigrants are a criminal element that are coming into the country and need to be controlled or stopped, if you think that MS-13 is ravishing Long Island, for example, that was an issue out here certainly, then he played to that. He played a lot of those fears. Now, we got the government that we got. I don't know if we got the government we deserved. It's up to you guys to decide, but we now have a split government. The reason I say he might have enjoyed that is because now if stuff goes wrong, he has somebody to blame. Okay, it's like the wall's not getting built. They won't give me the money. Well, who's not giving me the money? Nancy Pelosi, that Nancy Pelosi, those new Democratic socialists, those new people. They're not letting you have your way. I would give you everything you wanted. I would give you better benefits. I would take care of our veterans. I would build up the military. I would be the everlasting Prince of Peace, but the Democrats won't let me vote Republican in 2020. So I've seen that here in New York State even, where for a long time, I covered politics here. We had a divided Capitol. The governor was Republican, the Senate was Republican, the Assembly was Democratic. Or then it went the other way. And there was always the opportunity to blame the other guy. And, we talked about this sort of like this endless campaign. It's convenient for Trump, but at some point, it's sort of untenable because there are certain things, or there should be certain things, that even in a divided government, you can make America great again by, did he steal that from Ronald Reagan? Tell me he did. He stole that from Ronald Reagan. I just want to say that that was not an original campaign slogan. By fixing the roads, by having better schools. You don't necessarily have to make America great again, right, by building the wall. There are certain things that should be relatively nonpartisan that would be good gets, or, like things for, it's just as good for Pete King to deliver good roads as it is for Nancy Pelosi to deliver good roads. Okay, that should be relatively nonpartisan. But there's always some poison pill in there, and people are going to fight over it. And the president will not only benefit potentially from a divided government, but from a divided Democratic Party. He wouldn't mind people seeing, wouldn't see people fighting over the leadership. Seeing Nancy Pelosi having a dispute with incoming members of the freshman class who don't want her to be the leader. He'd love that. I mean, the more other people are tearing themselves up, the less they're concentrating on what he's doing. And all he has to do is get set up for the next campaign. So there's a lot of money, there's a lot of interest here, and I am looking forward to covering it. And yes, we are going to make it as exciting as possible. Governor Dean, I apologize. But I don't apologize that much because, look, if people get excited about politics, they get involved, and then they run, and then they win. The end.
Well, maybe that's a nice segue to a lot of points there's less. But Howard, I don't know if you want to talk if you want to talk about media coverage or the challenge of that. But I was thinking more about the point you made, Celeste, about the challenge of bipartisanship. And the Democratic Party is undergoing an internal battle right now. I think it's fair to say over the leadership in the House, and how that will be addressed, and then what that means for prospects for governing across the two chambers.
It's really fascinating. You know, one thing that you can say about everybody who works in Washington is they will fight to the death to preserve their own privilege. So you have the average age of the three. Hello? Hello?
Yep, that's
Okay.
it.
So you have the average age of the three most important leaders in the House is about 76, 77, I think.
Which is a nice age.
Yeah. It's a lovely age, but it has no reflection whatsoever about the people who are powering the Democratic recovery, which is the average age is probably around 35. So there has to be a change. I don't know what Nancy's going to do. I have a lot of respect for her, and I like her, and I think she's been a terrific leader. But something has to give, and the problem is, I mean, the way to do this right is to have her be reelected and then have two much younger people be her assistants. But it doesn't work that way because each of those younger people has to develop a base, and Steny Hoyer and Clyburn have been there for a long time, and they have a base. So this is going to be a pretty ugly fight. And the interesting thing about it, I don't think this will happen because I think Nancy's too smart for this, but it's possible that we'll have a Republican speaker in a Democratic House. Because what happens is you decide who the candidate's going to be in the caucus, and if the people who said they weren't going to vote for Nancy Pelosi don't vote for her in the caucus, she'll win anyway. But then it goes to the floor, and every member gets to vote. And usually the Democrats are the majority, the party sticks together, and the majority party controls the speakership. In this case, if the people who said they weren't voting for Nancy Pelosi don't vote, she could lose to a Republican. So I don't think that'll happen, but you know, this is new territory that we haven't seen for a really long time, like more than a century. And it has to be worked out, and the mechanism of working it out in this incredibly hidebound institution that hates change is very, very difficult. Interestingly enough, the Republican House is more flexible than the Democrats. I don't think this helps them run their caucus very well, but when Gingrich came in '94, he democratized the House. I thought at the time it was a good idea. That is, chairmen are elected in the Republican side. The speaker is elected, and it's much more of a democracy. That turns out to be a mess because Ryan was completely ineffective because he couldn't deal with 40 people who disagreed with him, which is the Tea Party caucus or whatever they call themselves, the Freedom Caucus. So I think the House can't be run as a democracy, even though it's the key group in a democratic country, because of the different interests and the power of individuals to screw everything up. But that's going to be on display now that the Democrats have taken over. And that's a major, major problem, which is going to get resolved sometime between now and the 10th of January. In terms of how this is there going to be any bipartisanship, probably not. And the reason is that, from my analysis, the Republican senators, and particularly McConnell, have so poisoned the atmosphere, especially over the Supreme Court nominations. They've basically changed the rules, rammed stuff through, prevented President Obama from nominating a Supreme Court justice when he had every right to do. We wouldn't even see them or bring it to a vote. I think there's so much ill will that basically nothing can get done. And in my opinion, the Republicans are so afraid of Trump that they're not going to cross him in any way. So we'll see. I mean, there is an immigration bill to be had, but even when we had George W. Bush, who was a pro-immigration president, we couldn't get an immigration bill done. There's a health care compromise. I think you've seen the last of the Republicans' attempts to get rid of Obamacare because that clearly was a major issue in the campaign. The last thing I want to say is I agree with Ed that we are horribly divided and angry and so forth and so on. It is possible that Trump will win re-election depending on who we nominate. But the problem with Trump is he can't get to anywhere. I don't think he's going to really struggle to get to anywhere near the votes he needs. Trump runs this because I think Trump is a psychiatrically ill person, and I think he's a narcissist. Well, I mean, I didn't say that to be mean to Trump. That's a sort of my medical view of it. And he cannot resist being the center of attention at all times. So this is all about Trump because it has to be all about Trump. He actually was quoted in a 1990 interview before he was in politics, telling a talk show host in New York, "Hey, man, this is about Trump all the time. It's all Trump all the time." Well, that's So he's turned the whole government into a giant reality television show, and it's always going to be about Trump. And he's very skilled at this. I mean, very skilled. The problem is he has a brand that is awful. It is truly awful. I mean, his brand is division, anger, and hate. And he's unfortunately branded the Republican Party with racism, division, anger, and hate. I don't think that's entirely fair because I think most Republicans are not racist and I don't think they hate people, but they are terrified, and they should be terrified. Bob Corker, who's a moderate, thoughtful guy, and Jeff Flake, who's a decent person and very conservative, crossed Trump. 48 hours later, they had to withdraw from their Senate races because Trump cut the legs out from under them and their approval ratings went down into the 20s and they couldn't run for re-election. So if you're facing somebody with that kind of power in your party, you are not likely to call them on their sins and force them to account. And that's what I think the major problem is. So I don't think we're quite ready for bipartisanship. Maybe we will be, but I think there'll be a new group of people in the House in the Republican Party, and I don't know anything about McCarthy or whatever. But McConnell has so poisoned the atmosphere. There's actually a lot of calls to get rid of Chuck Schumer because they don't think he was tough enough on McConnell, which I find to be very interesting because I consider him to be an incredibly smart politician. I think we're in for 2 more years of division, and I think then the young people are going to go out and fix that problem by getting rid of the Republicans. But we have to nominate somebody who's not 70 years old. And as you know, I've been adamant in this forum about saying that I would like somebody under 50, and I'll settle for under 55 if I have to. But we cannot have, this is not a time for candidates in my generation to be running for president of the United States in the Democratic Party, which has its core base, women, young people, people of color. We cannot run a candidate who doesn't look like the electorate that we hope to appeal to. So we're going to find out in this very complicated, huge primary who can succeed and who's not. I'm just incredibly glad that Michael Avenatti is no longer a viable candidate.
Oh, let me pick up with one point, Ed. I wonder if you'd share some thoughts on the divisions within the Republican Party. We've been focusing a lot on the Democratic victory in the House and the battle for the speakership. How do the Republicans contend with, obviously, these kind of pretty serious disagreements with the White House on a number of issues? Maybe actually not even so much on policy, but on the tone, the tweets, the way issues are presented. We've talked about the polarization. Is there a way to counter that within the party?
Trump owns what's left of the Republican Party at this point in time. And the perfect example was Florida. If you'd have said a year ago who were going to be the 2 candidates in Florida running for governor, neither of them would have been the 2 candidates that ended up running for governor. And Senator Graham's daughter was a congresswoman who was supposed to be the Democrat nominee. We had a former congressman who was the ag commissioner, who was everybody's all-time favorite, Putnam, supposed to be the nominee in their party. Trump stepped in and basically took DeSantis off of Fox Television and basically made him the nominee of the party. Just there's no question about that. Wherever Trump went in the primary, I mean, he, as you say, he knocked out Corker and he knocked out Flake, both of whom could have run again, but the likelihood is they would have been primaried, would have had a difficult time. My sense is there's a lot of anti-Trump people out there in the party, but they're not in active roles, and they won't be active roles. You see a few of them on talk radio and a few of them on cable television, but you don't see anybody standing up being very significant. John McCain being the last one, who's now obviously in heaven or wherever former war heroes go when they pass on. I'll give them the benefit of the doubt, put them in heaven. I think the real question now is if the Senate ends up at 52, and the untold story of this election was this was our map. This was the year in which we should have picked up 10 Senate seats, not 2. We had 26 of them up. We had 10 in states that clearly Trump had carried by big margins. People like Manchin and Tester were targets early on. He couldn't get them. The ones we won, Indiana was our state, had a fluke candidate 6 years ago. The same way Missouri, we had a fluke candidate 6 years ago. But I think the ones that really we should have won this time, the 3 or 4 others that we should have won, we didn't. The map shifts this next time, and the fact that Schumer's been quiet about it, there's a lot of moderate Republicans up next time, but we have the big class up next time, and they have the small class. So the map works to their benefit next time. My sense is, if the Democrats try to basically impeach Trump, it'll fail and fail miserably, because you're never going to have the votes in the Senate to do that. You may get it in the House, but we should have learned the lesson of the last go-around. And we're having this great discussion about speakers. I can tell you just again, in my lifetime, having run a campaign that defeated Tom Foley, who was the speaker, a fairly popular speaker, my history is Jim Wright got driven from office. Tom Foley got defeated at the polls. Basically, Newt Gingrich was driven from office. John Boehner is now basically going to be a lobbyist for marijuana. The one in between him and Gingrich went to jail for molestation. So I'm not sure. And Nancy Pelosi, who I think was, and I've known Nancy all my life from politics, is a great inside speaker, raised more money, did more things, is now having to fight for her life. And the leaders of the House, the Senate, Schumer, McConnell, all of them, have the worst numbers you could possibly have. So who the hell would want to be a speaker? And I'm pleased that now that you're turning 70 on this weekend, Howard, that you've taken yourself out of presidential politics. You're joining the over 70 group with me. But the reality is, we don't get to say who's going to be the candidate. You may want a young candidate, but it's a process. And when there's 20 people in the process, some very capable people, and you have to admit there is no front runner.
I'd say Biden is a front runner on name recognition. That's what the
but not overwhelmingly.
Right.
And,
that's correct.
and at the end of the day, Biden has never proven to be a good vote getter outside of Delaware, including in this go round. He certainly didn't do anything to enhance any candidate that he went out and campaigned as hard as anybody. So my sense is wide open. Someone may be a dark horse, someone may be a viable candidate that comes through the process, but it's going to be all debates, all kinds of things that we can't predict at this point in time. So I think the reality, though, is that Trump will run against the Congress. Trump will try and do international stuff. What I would be concerned about if I was Trump, there's a man who still wants to be president, who just got elected in Utah by the name of Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney basically, with a 2-vote margin, can certainly form a coalition with the 2 moderate women and probably find another one along the line. We have no idea if Scott gets finished off. Scott's pretty moderate. You could have 4 or 5 senators that are basically not necessarily in the Trump camp, and Mitt Romney is certainly not going to basically worry about at 70 years of age. All he has to do is live to be 90 to be the president of the Mormon Church if he doesn't get to be president of the United States. But my sense is he sort of still sees himself as a viable candidate, just as John Kerry does and Hillary does and a whole bunch of people. Once you've tried it, you're the only person I know, and again, you disqualified yourself by turning 70. Most people who try it want to come back again. So I don't think anybody can really tell what the map is of the future, other than the fact the largest group of voters in America today are not Democrats or Republicans. They're independents. And whoever wins the majority of independents basically wins congressional races, wins presidential races. 90% of those people go one way or the other, pretty much. If you're, say you're an independent, but 9 out of 10 times you vote Democrat, 9 out of 10 times you vote Republican. But they are the swing. And you go back and look at recent history. Whoever swings of that group, whoever gets a 10 or 15 point margin. I think women are activated. I think they're now in the game big time. The year of the woman here, we diminished our numbers. And the most prominent woman is going to be a person who's been in Congress for 22 months, is Liz Cheney, who's now the number 3 Republican in the House. And my sense is she'll be the one on the TV shows, what have you. So for our side, she basically will be a very significant woman. We lost women this time. We didn't gain. Democrats gained overwhelmingly. 2 things that I think are long-term. Democrats raised, this was a $5 billion midterm election, $5.5 billion midterm election. Democrats raised had some very significant big money people, Bloomberg and some others, but they raised the vast majority of their money by small donors. And that's not going to stop. Their grassroots efforts are going to continue. I think they are building a new party. I think Republicans may have to have a new party after Trump, but as long as Trump is running and what have you, it's still his party. I think both parties have to redefine themselves in the future. The biggest problem everybody faces is $4.2 trillion spent on the federal budget every year. There is no more money, and there's thousands of more programs that both sides want. So the battle is going to be over money. Again, there's no money for wall, there's no money for infrastructure, there's no money for all the things that they want, and there's certainly no money for universal health care. You're talking about the $3 trillion addition to the $4.2 trillion. And we're now back to a point where we're going to be running $1 trillion deficit again. In the very near future, you're going to see the payment on the debt being bigger than the payments on just about any other item in the budget. So I think the new people, as they get there, are going to learn a lot. They're going to get very serious about it. The old systems aren't going to work. And my sense is, I hope I live long enough to see it come back together to where people are in the game and working together. But you talked about immigration. Obamacare, President Obama had Democrat majorities, wanted to basically have an immigration bill, comprehensive immigration bill, couldn't get it to the Congress. President Bush had majorities in both houses, wanted an immigration bill, couldn't get it to the Congress. And you're not going to get immigration done or infrastructure done or health care done unless you basically sit down with people on the other side of the aisle and come to some compromise. And that ain't going to happen in the near future.
I just want to make one quick point. I don't actually think swing voters are independents that go back and forth. I actually think the new swing voters are those who don't vote and when they do vote. So, I mean, the way that we swung this election, this enormous midterm election, is getting a whole lot of people who didn't normally vote to vote. That is what I think the new swing voter in America is. I don't think it's any longer those who will consider either party.
Okay. First-time voters, though, were between 3 and 5%, though. I mean, I think there's a lot of people that didn't vote, but they were registered voters. But these are first-time voters, which is not a big number.
I had a couple more questions about infrastructure and election night exit polls, but I do want to give us time for questions. Let me just ask one. I'll just ask the election night question. Election night seemed as though it was going to be, and Celeste, maybe I'll direct it to you since you do a lot of news coverage. It seemed as though the Democrats were doing well, but the line of the evening seemed to be not as well as expected. But now, since then, with the recounts in Florida, the Georgia, the Mississippi runoff, even if the results are not expected to be surprising, the number of days it took for Arizona. Do we need to move? Is it even possible for us to move away from this wanting to know results on election night? And is that something we should try to achieve? Because it seems as though as we're getting, when races are called incorrectly, or even the 3rd District in New Jersey, Tom MacArthur, that was called for him on election night, and then it moved back. And then I think it was just this morning, I believe, that it was declared. The races in California that are still to be decided. Is there a way for us to? How do we move past this? Because it's better not to make a call than to make the call wrong, right? I'm not blaming you. I'm just saying, yeah. What do you think about it as the perspective of someone who reports on this?
Well, I don't know. On election night, I always have a joke. I always use the hashtag CK race call, which is my version of it that says, with 0% of 0 precincts reporting, we know absolutely nothing. So just hang out, read a book, maybe have something to eat. I get paid to care about this stuff. I get paid to, compulsively refresh these sort of things. But aside from the danger of making calls too early or making the wrong calls, the real danger to me is in some of these cases, unless it's an overwhelming margin. There were cases of races that were very close where the networks called or the candidates called. Sometimes the president is calling races now. That's kind of new. What worries me about that is sometimes people are still voting while that's going on. And you see a growing number of incredibly close races that are decided by 1,000 votes, 100 votes. There was a race famously in Virginia that had to be decided by a coin toss. because, it got to the point where, not only becoming an object lesson in the fact that your vote counts, but the fact that the electorate is so divided that sometimes these things are literally decided by chance because the people are not able to convincingly decide it by voting. So that part of it concerns me. I mean, look, are you going to stop people from wanting to know the answers immediately? Are you going to stop the networks from trying to compete to be the first to call a race? No, you're not going to do that. Why? Because people watch it because it sells advertising. Okay, so we could just be realistic about that. If you want to have considered analysis that takes longer, yeah, I mean, you have other places to go for that. The problem is, in a lot of cases, people don't get excited about elections until the very end, if they get excited at all. Some people don't have access to early voting, voting by mail, a lot of the things that encourage participation. So once they do get involved, though, they're invested and they want to know the answer. We live in an immediate gratification society, and it's no surprise to me that the outcome of an election should be any different, even when that's dangerous. The other thing is, in good news, you have people voting overseas, military and overseas balloting by mail. Those votes all deserve to be counted. They can affect the outcome in close races, and it's important to remember that these people deserve to have their voices heard just as much as the person who goes to the poll site at a public school or sends in a mail ballot because they're going to be out of town or something like that. I'm not going to say the media doesn't encourage, excitement, suspense about elections. I mean, but elections are the ultimate reality show in a way because that's reality. The person who wins, this is the person who's going to decide what you pay in taxes, where what your kids need to learn in school, how fast you can drive on your roads, how much they're going to take out of your check. So these things have real life consequences as much as it's nice to have like key race alert, or like
But there is no election day. I mean, going to your point,
right?
Everybody thinks early voting.
Every day is election day.
Well, for months it is. People think early voting, the votes are counted. They're not counted. They're not counted until the rest of it all closes. People that mail their things in are not counted till after all the rest of it. And so that's the process. And it's a very antiquated process, and we see it today where as much as Florida in 2000 we all lived through, they did all kinds of major overhaul, legislative mandated things and all the rest of it. And you still have machines that break down on doing recounts right now. I mean, it's just, we always let this be state and local as it probably should be. But there's the more options you give people, and I'm all for that, the more difficult it's going to become. Now, the interesting thing about this election, there were 14 governor's races that were dead even going in. There were 10 Senate races that were dead even going in. There were 30 congressional races that were dead even going in. The polling was very accurate this time. And the polling was very accurate 2 years ago in the sense if you take, she won by 3 or 4% of the popular vote. What they missed is the electoral votes in Michigan, Wisconsin. So everybody wants to know, and they want to know now. And that's as long as you're going to do that. It's a big show. Millions and millions of dollars are spent. And I can tell you, I predicted 3 weeks before the election the exact number. I said 35 House seats are going to be lost. I can count votes. I've done it. I live with those people. I got blasted for 45 minutes the day after by Rush Limbaugh, who said Ed Rollins doesn't know what the shit he's talking about. He's a Washington insider, where I've not lived for 25 years. He's just basically doing, he's just anti-Republican, which obviously I've been a Republican all my life. The bottom line is the people that were counting votes this time pretty much had a pretty accurate picture of it. If you read Cook Report or you read any of these things, they were pretty darn accurate. Real Clear Politics, which now takes not a singular poll, but takes 4 or 5 polls, puts them together, is very close to what things are. But the point is, you want to know instantaneously, and it's not an instantaneous process. It takes days and days and days to count votes in very close elections. If you win by 20 or 30 or 40,000 votes, I'm going to tell you a little truth that you probably don't know. If you win a district in California by 40, 50, 100,000 votes, votes aren't even counted. The absentee ballots aren't counted for weeks and weeks, and they're never put into the system till a month after that. It's the close ones that matter, and the close ones are we have former Congressman MacArthur, who's called election night, basically when they do the recounts and all the rest of it. So we're seeing democracy in action, and democracy in action is you want more people to have more access to the polling places, and that basically is a complicated system.
And I just heard about Florida this morning, of course, as the manual recount begins in the governor's race. They're not recounting all of them, but selected ones, right?
Right.
And so it's a lengthy process. On that note, I have more questions I'd like to ask, but I think we have about 20 minutes left for audience questions. What I'd like to ask is we have 2 microphones up here. So if people could come down to the microphone. We have several classes in attendance, and so we'd like to give students a chance to ask a couple of questions. We're going to ask you to keep if you can go over to the microphone. I see you heading over there. If you could just keep the questions short so that we can maximize time for discussion and direct your question to someone. So why don't we start over here? And we'll try to go back and forth, but I am going to try to take more student questions, just so you know. So, okay, please, go ahead.
Hi. Ooh, good morning. So I have a question for Mr. Dean. We've mentioned before, you mentioned before, you were speaking about the Democratic Party and how they need a younger candidate for the presidential election. Hillary Clinton has recently expressed interest in running again in 2020. Do you think by allowing her to run, if she becomes the candidate again, would that be a misstep for the party, and what kind of consequences would that have?
Hillary Clinton has absolutely no interest in running again. That was an article by Hillary Clinton has absolutely no interest in running again. That was an article in the Wall Street Journal editorial page. It was not exactly a friend of the Democrats, done by 2 senile, out-of-the-box people who haven't participated in Democratic politics for a very long time. Hillary will not run.
Okay. I do have like another question though. But if we do go for a younger candidate, which I do think that would be a better call as a younger person. But if you do go for a younger candidate, Mr. Rollins mentioned name recognition. How much do you think that would play into it?
Initially, that's the interesting part. The older generation, my generation, has candidates with name recognition in it because they've been around for longer. There are a ton of younger, interesting candidates who don't have a lot of name recognition. I'll name a few of them. John Hickenlooper, the ex-governor of Colorado, or soon-to-be ex-governor. Steve Bullock, the ex-governor of Montana. Cory Booker, he does have name recognition. Eric Garcetti, 46 years old, the mayor of Los Angeles. Kamala Harris is well known. Kirsten Gillibrand is another one. Chris Murphy, the senator from Connecticut, who's done a very credible guy. And a superstar who I've actually never met and haven't made up my mind about yet is Beto O'Rourke. That's why Beto O'Rourke is interesting, because he gets that kind of a reaction. He's the only person who gets that kind of reaction when I mention his name. Okay. I know nothing about him other than he is as charismatic as anybody we have in the Democratic Party. So this is a wide open race, and the purpose of, I always said, look, the purpose of campaigning is to get the name recognition that allows you to win. When I ran, I had 0 name recognition. In September, I was leading the field. So, you know, anything can happen in these debates. And look, as Ed said, who would have thought that Donald Trump was going to become the nominee? He did have a lot of name recognition because of The Apprentice show, but it was a shocking outcome. So anything can happen in these races. And as Ed said, there will be a lot of debates, and there'll be people who are running around. And Beto, of course, obviously has name recognition and a lot of appeal to this generation. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't even know if I'm going to endorse a candidate before the election, before the convention. But it's just a fascinating year, and there's a lot of really great young people who nobody knows much about that could run and I think could win.
Okay, thank you. Let's take another question over here, and then I'll come over this way. Go ahead.
All right, so the words that the media has been using when covering the midterm elections over the past few weeks.
Can you talk a little louder, please?
Excuse me?
Can you talk a little louder?
Oh, I'm sorry. The words that the media has been using for the last 2 weeks, I think the main word is wave. And I think some people may classify this as a blue wave or a red wave, but this question is actually directed towards Howard Dean. Do you think that it's more accurate to define this race as a wave pertaining to parties, or do you think it's more accurate to talk about this election as a wave pertaining to maybe age or gender or some other thing other than parties, or even a wave at all?
First of all, this is a nonsense conception because the media loves this kind of stuff. There's a debate about whether this is a wave. Tell me one piece of policy that has anything to do with whether this is or is not a wave. I mean, really. So, but having said that, I do, as I open my remarks, I do not believe there's a right versus left battle to the death going on in the Democratic Party. If you look at the candidates, I think your generation in general is very what we would call, I think these terms are out of date, liberal about social issues. You like diversity, you like women's rights, you believe that gay rights is the civil rights issue of your time, and you're more conservative about money than the left wing of the Democratic Party. Many of you are sort of libertarian economically. So I think this is about young versus old. I think, at least on our side, this is the younger generation finding their voice as we did during the 60s and beginning to take over the apparatus of government. It is a long haul, especially for a generation who's grown up believing they don't need institutions, so politics is irrelevant. I think a lot of the people that voted don't even really particularly like parties, but they voted for the Democrats because the values of our party are much like the values of your generation. So whether it's a wave or not, I mean, I'm not getting into that debate. I think that's for MSNBC and CNN and Fox and all this stuff. I think it has nothing to do with anything. I think the real issue is this a generational handover? And I think it is.
As a Republican, I think it was a wave and they drowned half of us.
Okay. Please, go ahead.
In view of the fact that there are still races that are undecided yet because they're still counting votes, what do you think about our president trying to illegitimize the votes that, the election? Like even this morning, he said people are going in, they're voting, they're going out, changing their clothes, and then re-voting. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you hear what I said?
Yes. You want me to answer? You want Howard to answer?
Whoever.
Let's give that one to Ed.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Donald Trump says things that he thinks is right without any empirical data. He would flunk most courses in political science. My sense is that when the votes are all certified by secretaries of state in these states that come in through county systems, you'll know who the voters are and who's legitimate voters. I mean, I think the process that we're going through again in Florida is a lot of it wouldn't matter if it wasn't a close election. If either one of those candidates would have won by 100 or 200,000 votes, we wouldn't even be having the discussion. But the reality is, when you got a state that most of the elections have been decided by one vote, 1% of the vote, including Trump's victory, which is 107,000 votes, I think, in Florida last time. You're going to fight and argue and push and shove and what have you. So my sense is he's going to say outrageous things over and over and over again, and that's just the reality. You either like it or you don't like it. Some people don't care. Some people do care. I happen to like accuracy and empirical data, but that doesn't mean much. So.
I just think it's dangerous. That's what my opinion is.
Well, even if he was telling the truth 100% of the time, you wouldn't be a supporter. So.
Celeste, did you want to comment on that as well?
Just the idea. Well, it's sort of a separate issue. I mean, I think that it's very dangerous. Some of the ideas that the president puts forward about the extent of voter fraud in this country are, to say wildly exaggerated, would be an understatement. He claimed he only lost the popular vote because 3 to 5 million people improperly cast ballots in 2016. I have not seen proof of that. He developed a presidential panel to look into this. The Presidential Advisory Committee on Election Integrity. He had to disband it because of a national outcry from secretaries of state and election administrators all over this country who said, why are we putting the data of every single voter in the United States into a centralized, possibly not secure database? And who is that information for? And why does it include stuff not just about like whether you voted, but your military record and your arrest record. Data collection is big business in politics. We've alluded to in some cases here already, but I think the idea of questioning the integrity of the system does a couple of things. It undermines people's faith in the mechanism that we use for peaceful transfer of power in this country, which is a really big deal. It casts doubt on the outcome of elections that he doesn't like, and potentially, if you want to be really depressing about it, I'm not saying this is going to happen, but it does set up a scenario where you could see him or people around him not accepting a legitimate but undesirable outcome in a future election. And that, for any party, is very disturbing. I mean, it's like you run, you do your best, you try to get as many people to support you, you win or you lose. That's how it's supposed to work. But what if you lose, but you don't accept you lose? What happens then? Interesting way to keep yourself up at night. If you want
Good
to.
question. Thank you. We're going to go over here now. Go ahead,
Sure.
please.
My question is for Mr. Rollins. So, what do you think it's going to take to get young people to get out and get excited to start voting Republican?
I'm sorry, speak a little louder.
Sure. What do you think it's going to take to get young people excited to come out and vote for Republicans?
First of all, you have to have some young people involved in it, and I think to a certain extent there are young people. It's not all. I mean, I think the key thing about anything about politics and in my lifetime in the game, you have to relate to what the audience is. You have to figure out what it is that people want to talk about, what the problems are. Young people today are facing some very serious economic problems in the sense of, Howard and I could go to college and get out and start our lives without $60,000, $100,000 student loan debts. That's a big issue for a lot of young people. Jobs are going to be a big, significant issue for a lot of young people. We are the party that historically has been the fiscal conservative party. We've sort of lost our way on that a little bit. And I would argue at this point in time that you've got to connect with people and be the pro-business. We have to basically have young people out there. It's like other communities. I've always said, and I've fought this for 50 years. We always have programs to go out and try and get African American voters. And I say a white guy like me going out and saying why you should be a Republican is absurd. We need to go find some African Americans and elect them to districts. And there are districts that you can elect people here, the Republican districts or Democrat districts. And then let them go out and give their sermon. My sense is young people are going to be, Democrats did a very effective job of going out and recruiting a lot of young candidates this time. They're going to be members of Congress. They're going to be state legislators. We have some, but nowhere near the same kind of numbers. And my sense is you got to basically figure out what it is that you want to hear and discuss, and not give you everything you want. I mean, I can't basically say, okay, we're going to free everybody's college loan, which many would like to have happen. But you economically can't do that. But I think to a certain extent, I would just argue that I would hope as young people, you would not get stuck in one party or the other. Howard was a Republican growing up, and now obviously a Democrat. I was a Democrat growing up, obviously a Republican. I hope my 23-year-old daughter, who's a Hillary person, will somewhere in the course of her lifetime vote for a Republican. Won't be her dad, but it'll be somebody. I guess what I'm saying to you is more and more people are going to basically find a candidate they like and get behind that candidate, and that candidates sort of draw the Beto, as you said earlier. Who would have said a young congressman in Texas is going to give Ted Cruz a run for his money and raise more money than was raised in presidential politics? Well, he lit a match, and it turned out to be a torch. It turned out to be a bonfire, and I think to a certain extent he had a message. And Republicans have to have a message that communicates to young people like yourself.
Can I just say one quick point about that? Is that talking about the parties recruiting and trying to draw people in and getting excited on both sides, Republicans and Democrats. The Republicans have certainly work to do with women and minorities. But the interesting thing about a lot of the people who ran and won, some of the record breakers in this election, were people who were not supported by the party. who were not the choice to be the Democratic nominee, and they didn't want to hear that, and they didn't want to wait. So I think that maybe the future of reshaping the party, whether it's the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, is people who do not feel like they need to wait their turn to be told when it's time to run and what to do when they win.
And I would just add to that, Celeste, the primary races, not just the generals, right? I mean, when you look at New York, right? Good point. All right, I'm going to try to, we have about 7 minutes. If they can be very quick, 1, 2, 3. That'll be it, okay? Go ahead, please.
This is the third time that I have been at one of these seminars, and to you, Mr. Rollins, and input, of course, from Ms. Katz and Dr. Dean as well. And about 6 months ago, and I took extensive notes, you said you grew tired of trying to defend the indefensible regarding
Sure.
Donald Trump, and that you've decided to keep your mouth quiet.
It's a little hard when I'm on TV 14 times a week.
Along with that goes what you said, defend the indefensible. I'm going to shift to today's, we are anticipating the ruling of the judge about Jim Acosta and CNN and the press. So we all know there's been an attack on the press. With the new Congress, with the new House, could there be, and this is for Dr. Dean as well, could there be the Democrats in the House vociferously voicing tremendous disapproval to the public in the press about Trump's attack on the press, whereas before they were in the minority and their voice was suppressed?
I'm sure they will. I don't think it's going to have the impact on Trump, though. I think the reality is that, 70% of the people who voted for Democrat wanted to impeach him. Said that in the exit polls. That doesn't mean it's going to happen. Doesn't mean it's a good thing. The freedom of the press is in the Constitution, and the reality is, does freedom of the press mean that anybody can walk into a press conference, say I represent the paper here at Hofstra, and get press credentials and have the opportunity to stand up? Or does freedom of the press mean that someone who's discourteous and basically does the things that Acosta? We've made Acosta. Acosta's now got a speaking tour for the rest of his life. He's going to make a fortune. He'll have the biggest contract at CNN. Is CNN being deprived of freedom of the press when they have 50 credentialed reporters at the White House? I would argue that, we'll see what the court says. I remember when CNN in 1980 wanted White House credentials, and they were turned down by the White House, the Reagan White House, that I was a part of. They went into a federal court, and the other media was against them because they said they weren't a legitimate news agency, ABC, CBS, what have you. They got accredited. The judge basically sided with them. I'm sure the judge is going to side with Acosta. But at the end of the day, I also think the president and the White House has a right to decide who comes in and who goes out, whether you're a citizen or whether you're a media person or what have you. So, and I think there's a real difference between freedom of the press, which obviously Acosta can write, say anything he wants, and that's freedom of the press, or basically gets to come to the White House and sit in the front row and hog questions. So.
Did you want to comment?
No, just I totally agree with Ed actually on a lot of that freedom of the press does not mean that you're entitled to a hard pass, and right. That there are not issues. There are issues of decorum in terms of asking the president, the manner in which you ask the president questions. Although personally, I would hope that people don't hold back. The thing I worry about is that whether Acosta wins or loses, who's going to be next and why? That's my deep concern is that, this time it's because, it was a guy who was loud and inappropriate and doesn't conduct himself in the Brady room or whatever it is in a manner befitting a member of the White House press corps. What if it's somebody who asks a question the president doesn't like or works for a guy the president doesn't like? Or
it goes on every day, though.
Right, but, when they pull somebody's passport.
They haven't historically.
A lot of things haven't happened yet.
Okay. All right, good point. Thank you. All right, we're going to try to get these last two in really fast. Go ahead.
As it was said before, this government is in like a very heated and bitter
Could you
climate.
talk just a little bit louder?
Sorry.
Yeah, we have two 70-year-olds on the stage, two young women.
As said before, the government is in like a very heated and bitter type of climate between the two parties. Do you think that too many people, especially voters and like younger people, are looking at more as a good versus evil perspective instead of two parties working together to like better the country?
I think it's not just the parties. I think there's an animosity that's come about in the last couple of years, whether it's because of Trump or because of the changes going on in society, in which there's real hostility out there, in which and I think it's very sad as a country. I think it's sad what happens on academic communities here, where people are rejected for their viewpoints, and this is the place you should be able to come and have any kind of viewpoint you want, and discuss it and debate it. But I think there's a real lack of civility in the society, and I think that's and the polarization that's occurred in politics and other elements is more severe than I've seen it in my long life. And I think that's what has to happen.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's try to get in the last question.
Hi. So, as there's been a recent surge in hate crimes in the country, do you feel like that was reflected in the current midterm elections? And how do you think that's going to affect like Trump's administration and all that in the upcoming election?
Well, I do think that Trump's rhetoric gives permission to people to do things that they would ordinarily not do. Look, evil lurks in all of our hearts. That's unfortunately a human condition. And a lot of the institutions that we build are built to sort of contain that part of us which causes things like the Holocaust or causes hate crimes in Pittsburgh or wherever else. So that exists in humanity. And the question is, can we build institutions? And it's not just institutions like the United Nations or the Declaration of Independence or whatever. It's a social opprobrium for people who do those things. If it is socially unacceptable, fewer people do it. And that's the problem. The President of the United States is making it socially acceptable to say things that are really outrageous, racist, misogynist, and so forth and so on. That has to be pushed back on. It has to be pushed back on, not because he's a Republican or whatever. It has nothing to do with that. You cannot have people that seek to divide us. And that is what this president has done very successfully. He has appealed to the very worst instincts of humanity. What we have to do as politicians is realize we have a responsibility to appeal to the best instincts of humanity. There is the best parts of humanity. There are enormous numbers of politicians going back as far as in history as there have been human beings on the earth with a social structure who take the shortcut. It is really easy to get people to the polls out of anger, especially by saying things that aren't true. But let's not forget, Adolf Hitler was elected democratically as the Chancellor of Germany. That is what happens if you appeal to the worst in people. Somebody has, look, we're all going to have feelings of the sort that lead to these terrible things. Somebody has to say it's not okay. The social structure has to do it. Teachers have to do it. Leaders of any kind have to do it. Local people have to do it. And certainly the President of the United States has to do it. And that is the core problem. Now, isn't all blame, you can't all blame this on Trump. Trump has been by far the worst part of it, but this was going on before Trump got on the scene. And a lot of it, I think, had to do with the fact that we had an African-American president. I really do. And I think that, you know, Hillary was a flawed candidate, but I think a lot of the problems she had was because she was a woman. This is all, we're in a big social surge of change here, and that always makes people uncomfortable. If you're a 55-year-old white guy without a college education, living in a rural area, and you lose your job, you're not getting another one in this country, except for maybe $10 an hour. And that is a huge change. Women now comprise the majority in the most prestigious universities, law schools, and medical schools in this country. That is an enormous change in 40 years. These changes are very threatening to people, and people get uncomfortable with change. When you have this kind of social change, you need leadership that is willing to say, yes, we have these changes, yes, we have to do something about it, but we are not going to turn on each other. And I think there's been an enormous leadership failure by those in power, particularly in my generation, and that is why I want change, and generational change. I do not think my generation, and I plead as guilty to this as anybody else, who grew up in the culture wars and continue the culture wars, is ready to lead us in a place where we have to heal ourselves after the results of the culture wars, which have resulted in the empowerment of women and the empowerment of people of color in this country, where they can finally become equal citizens.
Well, I think
Maybe you ought to reconsider running for president, Howard. You're doing real well out here.
well, on that note, I think we can say the torch is being passed to a new generation. Please join me in thanking our panelists for a very informative discussion.